Torrential rain poured down. Ethan stood at the entrance of the Lynn family villa, looking at Vivian, who had been kneeling for 3 hours, and said indifferently, "Since you refuse to marry me, then I'll find someone else. Doesn't the Lynn family still have Clara?" As soon as the words left his mouth, he took out his phone on the spot and dialed his assistant. "Release the news immediately. The parties for the Jianglin marriage alliance are Clara and me. Push it to the entire web. I want to see it trending within 10 minutes. A deathly silence fell over the scene. Richard's face was livid, and the teacup in his hand smashed onto the floor with a crash. Margaret clutched her chest, nearly fainting. As for Vivian, she was still kneeling in the rain, soaked to the bone, her shoulders trembling slightly. She was smiling. Ethan hung up the phone, turned around, and said to his parents, who stood there as if struck dumb, "Dad, Mom, we're leaving." William opened his mouth, about to speak, but seeing the unwavering determination in his son's eyes, he ultimately swallowed his words. Catherine's expression was complicated. She glanced back at Vivian. That girl was nodding at her, nodding urgently, as if afraid she might misunderstand something. Catherine's heart gave a jolt, but she said nothing and followed her son toward the door. Richard stood up abruptly. "Ethan, what do you mean by this?" "I mean exactly that," Ethan said without turning his head. "Since the Lynn family wants a marriage alliance, I'll just find someone else. Didn't Clara just return to the country? Perfect." "You!" Richard was trembling with rage, yet he couldn't get a single word out. 7 years ago, Ethan forcibly kissed Clara in public, and the very next day, she fled the country overnight. Everyone in North City knew that she had been hiding from him for 7 years. Now he's actually asking to replace someone on his own initiative? Crazy. Ethan pushed his parents out of the Lynn family gate as the rain began to ease. As the car door opened, he glanced back. Ethan pushed his parents out of the Lynn family gate as the rain began to ease. As the car door opened, he glanced back. Vivian was still kneeling in the rain. Ethan made an okay gesture to her. Vivian's shoulders trembled even more violently. She was nodding frantically. Before getting into the car, Ethan added another gesture. Thumb and pinky forming a 6, held against his ear. Contact by phone. Vivian understood, burying her face in her soaked palms. The car door closed, and the black sedan disappeared into the curtain of rain. Half an hour ago, in Ethan's car, he sent a WeChat message to Vivian. Just 6 words. "As planned, wait on your knees." Vivian replied with a single word. "Okay." The phone screen dimmed. Ethan leaned back in his seat, watching the rain outside, expressionless. Leo leaned over from the passenger seat. "Are you really going to replace him? What about the head of the Henry family? When have I ever joked with you?" Leo shut up. He had known Ethan for 10 years and knew that once this man made a decision, not even 9 oxen could drag him back. But he still added, "As for Clara, are you sure she'll take the bait?" Ethan didn't answer. He just watched the windshield wipers swinging back and forth, his eyes too deep to see the bottom. "She will." Half an hour later, Ethan sat in his living room, holding a teacup, his expression calm. William sat opposite him, his face dark. Catherine stood by the window, saying nothing. "Explain." William spoke only 2 words. "There is nothing to explain." Ethan set down his teacup. "Vivian has someone else in her heart. I don't want to marry someone who doesn't have me in hers. Clara is different." "Different?" William sneered. 7 years ago, she went abroad overnight. Wasn't that because you forced a kiss on her? Now you're asking to marry her yourself. Do you think she'll agree?" "She will agree." Ethan stood up. "Dad, you just need to wait for the wedding celebration." "You?" William wanted to say something more, but Ethan had already turned and gone upstairs. Catherine suddenly spoke. "Son." Ethan stopped in his tracks. "That girl Vivian." "She was just nodding," Catherine said. "Did you two plan this?" Ethan didn't turn his head. He merely said, "Mom, your son isn't that much of a bastard. He wouldn't make a joke of a girl's reputation." Catherine paused, stunned, and didn't ask any further. William snorted coldly. You just spoil him, Catherine sighed. William, do you think our son is the kind of person who burns all his bridges? William fell silent. Upstairs, in the study, Ethan opened his phone, and the top trending topic was prominently displayed. Jiang and Lin families change marriage partners. Ethan specifically requests to marry Clara. The comments section exploded. Wasn't it Vivian? Isn't Clara the one who ran off overnight after being forcibly kissed 7 years ago? Mr. Ethan, what is he trying to do? Forcefully take and seize? The Lin family is probably going to go crazy. Ethan glanced at it, expressionlessly turning off his phone. He pulled open the drawer and took out a photograph from the very back. In the photo, a girl stood before a piano, her profile cool and detached, her gaze distant. Clara, 7 years. He turned the photo over. On the back was a line he had written himself, the handwriting still carrying the callousness of 18-year-olds. Clara, waiting for you to return, no matter how long. He stared at that line for a long time, then tucked the photograph back into the deepest recess of the drawer. His phone vibrated. It was a WeChat message from Leo. The Lin family has already started their PR campaign. Henry, the family head, called personally to throttle traffic across all platforms. Ethan, you've gone a bit too far this time. Ethan replied with a single word. Yeah. Leo replied instantly. Just yeah? Do you realize Henry is so furious his blood pressure spiked? Ethan didn't reply to that message. He opened his contacts and scrolled to a number he hadn't dialed in 7 years. The note was just 3 words. Little piano. He stared at the name for a few seconds, then locked the screen and tossed his phone aside. No rush. The fish hasn't taken the bait yet. The next afternoon, Leo pushed open the door to Ethan's place carrying 2 cups of coffee and slammed one down on his desk. Did you sleep last night? Ethan didn't even look up. Slept pretty well. Leo rolled his eyes, sat down opposite him, and took a swig of coffee. She's been avoiding you for 7 years, and you still haven't given up? Ethan leaned back on the sofa and said indifferently, Why should I give up? Big brother. She almost sent you away back then. Leo widened his eyes. If your dad hadn't suppressed it, you'd be sitting in a cell right now. So? Ethan looked at him. So you still want to marry her? Leo was exasperated. Do you have some kind of masochistic tendency? Ethan didn't answer. He thought back to that night 7 years ago. At the drinking party after the college entrance exam, he had a lot to drink, but he wasn't completely drunk. He knew what he was doing. He cornered Clara in the hallway and forced a kiss on her. She didn't dodge. She just kept her eyes open, watching him quietly. Her gaze was complicated. The next day, she went abroad. She didn't even say goodbye. Ethan? Leo asked tentatively, seeing him remain silent. What exactly are you plotting? Nothing. Ethan stood up. It's just that some debts, dragged out for 7 years, are due for interest. Leo. He felt there was something off about those words. But seeing Ethan's expression, he couldn't bring himself to ask. His phone vibrated. Ethan looked down. It was a WeChat message from Clara. Are you okay? A very simple sentence. No interrogation, no anger, just a faint concern. Ethan stared at the screen and smiled. He tapped the voice message button and said just one sentence. Stop comforting me. Then he turned off his phone and tossed it aside. Leo leaned over. Who is it? Fish. What fish? Ethan ignored him and turned to go upstairs. Leo scratched his head, feeling that everything Ethan said today sounded more and more like the ravings of a madman. 3 days. A whole 3 days, and he hadn't replied to a single message. Clara sent 2 more WeChat messages, but he didn't reply to either. The first one, Ethan, what's going on with that trending topic? The second one, if you're trying to get back at me, there's no need for this. He didn't reply. On the evening of the 4th day, his phone rang. Caller ID Clara. Ethan looked at the name on the screen, waited 5 seconds, and then answered the phone. Ethan. Her voice was still as cold as it had been 7 years ago. "What is wrong with you?" Ethan looked at the night outside the window, the corner of his mouth curling into a faint smile. The fish had taken the bait. He spoke slowly, his voice hoarse. "Clara, I want to see you." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then, Clara's voice came through. "Okay." The next day, the first snow of the season fell in the North City. Ethan worked overtime at the office until 10 o'clock at night. Leo called. "Ethan, someone is looking for you. Downstairs at the company." "Who?" "Guess." Leo's voice carried a hint of amusement. "Clara is here personally to pick you up." Ethan paused for a moment. He stood up, picked up his coat, and walked towards the elevator. Downstairs at the company, a black sedan was parked by the roadside. The window rolled down, revealing Clara's profile. She was wearing a white cashmere coat, her long hair loose, her expression cool and distant. 7 years, and she was still the same. Distant, cold, as if separated by a layer of mist. Ethan walked over and opened the car door. "Get in," Clara said, her eyes fixed straight ahead, not looking at him. He sat in the passenger seat and closed the door. The heater inside the car was blasting, yet she still gripped the steering wheel without turning her head. Ethan didn't move. He just looked at her, from her profile to her jawline, and then to her hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. Her hands were pale with slender fingers, clearly the hands of a pianist. "Have you seen enough?" Clara said coldly. Ethan smiled. 7 years, and I still can't get enough." Clara paused. She turned her head and looked him straight in the eye. The distance between them was less than half a meter. At this distance, all he had to do was reach out to touch her. "Ethan." Clara turned her head to look at him. "I have that surveillance footage." "I know. Aren't you afraid I'll release it tomorrow?" Ethan leaned back in his seat and glanced at her. "You've kept it for 7 years without publishing it. Why publish it tomorrow?" Clara sneered. "I just got back, and you've been trending on the hot search all day." Ethan didn't speak. Clara took a step closer. "What exactly do you want to do?" Ethan looked at her, his gaze calm. "To repay a debt," he said. 7 years ago, I owed you a sentence." Clara frowned. "What?" Ethan didn't answer. He suddenly reached out, clasped the back of her head, and pulled her towards him. The moment their lips touched, Clara's pupils contracted sharply. She didn't resist. She just kept her eyes open, looking at him, just like 7 years ago. Ethan released her and stepped back a little, looking into her eyes. "I'll save these words," he said in a low voice, "for our wedding night." Clara stared at him, her chest rising and falling slightly. Then, she smiled. That smile was cold, like snow. "Ethan," she said, "you think that just because you kissed me, I'll marry you?" "You will," Ethan said with certainty. "On what grounds?" "I hold your 7 years ago in my hands." Ethan looked at her. "And you hold my 7 years ago." Clara's expression changed. She let go of the steering wheel, turned around, and looked him straight in the eye. "Ethan," she said, articulating every word. 7 years ago I almost had you hauled off to the station. Do you really think I don't know what you're plotting?" Ethan smiled. He leaned back in his seat, perfectly at ease. "Then why haven't you sent it?" Clara paused. "You've had the surveillance footage in your hands for 7 years. He looked at her. "The first thing you said when you returned to the country was to ask me, 'Are you okay?' You kept it, not waiting for it to destroy me, but waiting for me to find you." Clara's fingers gripping the steering wheel tightened for an instant. "Now that you've waited for it," Ethan said, "stop hiding." Clara stared at him for a long time. Then she looked away, gripped the steering wheel again, and started the car. "Ethan," she said, "you're crazy." "Maybe so." He turned his head, looking at the swirling snow outside the window. "But between a madman and a fool, one of them has to speak up first." Clara didn't say anything more. The car drove through the snow and soon arrived at the entrance of the Jiang family villa. Before getting out of the car, Ethan glanced back. Clara was still gripping the steering wheel, not looking at him. "Clara," he said. She didn't move. "In 3 days," Ethan said. "It's your dad Henry's 80th birthday. I'll be there." Clara paused. "By then," Ethan continued, "I hope you'll be there." With that, he closed the car door and turned to walk into the villa. He took 5 steps, then stopped again. Without looking back, "Clara, if you're planning to release that surveillance footage at the birthday banquet, I advise you to choose a different time." Clara sat in the car, her hands suddenly tightening. "Why?" Her voice came from inside the car window, trembling slightly. "It was my mother's birthday that day," Ethan said. "I didn't want her 50th birthday party to turn into a farce." Clara froze. Ethan waited 3 seconds, and when he didn't get an answer, he pushed open the door and entered the villa. Inside the car, Clara sat in the darkness, watching his retreating figure. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. She had carried that surveillance footage from 7 years ago with her for 7 years. She had thought she would never see Ethan again in this lifetime. But fate had brought them together once more. She took a deep breath and took a USB drive out of her bag. The USB drive was very small, only the size of a fingernail. Inside was the complete surveillance footage from 7 years ago. It wasn't just a forced kiss. There was also footage of him kneeling on the ground, begging her not to leave after she pushed him away, and footage of her crying as she said, "I can't hurt you." Back then, after she called the police, the school retrieved the hallway surveillance footage. She obtained a copy, originally intending to hand it over to the police. But in the end, she didn't. She left. She took the USB drive with her. And he, later, through Leo's connections, he obtained another copy of the original master tape from the school security office. She never knew about this. Clara stared at the USB drive, her expression complex. She had originally planned to publicly release the surveillance footage at her father's birthday banquet, to utterly destroy Ethan, and to completely ruin this arranged marriage. But now, he had figured out the date. His mother's birthday. How could he have calculated it so precisely? She clenched the USB drive, remained silent for a long time, then started the car and drove into the snowy night. In the living room, as Ethan walked in, Leo was sitting on the sofa, holding a cup of tea. "How was it?" Leo asked. Ethan didn't answer. He walked to the window and looked at the swirling snow outside. "Leo," he said, "help me check something." "What?" "Has Clara had a boyfriend in the past 7 years?" Leo paused for a moment, then smiled. "Mr. Ethan, are you checking for a love rival?" Ethan ignored him. "Also," he said, "check what she brought back with her this time." Leo nodded. "All right." Ethan turned and headed for the stairs, but stopped halfway. "One more thing." "What?" Ethan turned back, his gaze intense. "Prepare a ring for me." Leo nearly spilled his tea. "A ring?" "Yes," Ethan said. "I'm going to propose publicly at Henry's birthday banquet." Leo widened his eyes. "Are you serious?" "I've been serious since 10th grade. After saying that, Ethan went upstairs. Leo sat on the sofa, stunned for a long moment, before muttering, "This kid, he's actually playing for real." 3 days later, at the Lynn family villa. It was Henry's 80th birthday, and guests gathered in crowds. Dressed in a black suit, Ethan stood in the crowd, his gaze sweeping across the lobby. Clara wasn't there. He frowned. Leo leaned in and whispered, "She hasn't arrived yet." Ethan nodded, picked up his glass, and walked over to Henry. "Uncle Henry," he said with a smile, "wishing you boundless happiness and a long life." Henry looked at him with a complex expression. "Ethan," he said, "I hear you're going to marry Clara?" "Yes." Ethan admitted it frankly. Henry fell silent for a moment, then sighed. "You still haven't settled the score from 7 years ago." "It'll be settled soon," Ethan said. "Within the next few days." Henry looked at him, and after a long while he shook his head. "Young and impetuous." Ethan smiled and offered no explanation. He turned and walked toward a corner of the lobby, and no sooner had he stopped than a commotion erupted at the entrance. Clara had arrived. She was wearing a red dress, her long hair pinned up to reveal her slender neck, like a red rose blooming in the snow. Ethan watched her, his gaze darkening. Clara walked into the lobby, her eyes sweeping over the crowd before finally landing on Ethan. Their gazes met in the air. She didn't look away. She simply gave him a faint glance, then walked toward Henry. "Dad," she said, "happy birthday." Henry looked at her, his expression complex. "Clara," he said, "you're here." Clara nodded and stepped aside. In the lobby, the guests whispered among themselves. "Is she Clara? The one from 7 years ago? Is Mr. Ethan going to propose in public today? This is going to be quite a show." Ethan held his glass and slowly walked toward Clara. Leo was beside him, stomping his feet in anxiety. "Ethan, are you really going to do it now?" Ethan didn't answer. He walked up to Clara and looked at her. "Clara," he said. Clara looked up at him. "Ethan," she said, her tone indifferent, "I have something to tell you." Ethan reached out his hand. "Can I borrow you for a moment?" Clara looked at his outstretched hand and didn't move. The lobby fell silent as everyone watched them. "Mr. Ethan," Clara began, "say whatever you have to say right here." Ethan looked at her, his gaze deep. "Okay," he said. Then, to the shock of everyone present, he dropped to one knee. He took a red velvet box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a diamond ring, sparkling in the light. "Clara?" Ethan looked into her eyes. "Marry me." The entire room was in an uproar. Henry's expression changed. Richard and Margaret's expressions changed as well. Only Clara remained expressionless. She looked at Ethan, at the ring in his hand. Then her gaze slowly moved downward, landing on her clenched right hand. In that hand, she was gripping a USB drive. The sharp edges of the drive dug painfully into her palm. She should reveal it. She should destroy him. But, "Clara," Ethan's voice sounded again. "I know what you're thinking." Clara paused in her movements. "You want to ruin me?" Ethan said frankly. "You want to release that surveillance footage in front of everyone and destroy my reputation." The faces of the Lynn parents changed drastically. "Surveillance?" Richard exclaimed. "What surveillance?" Ethan ignored him. He just looked at Clara. His voice neither loud nor soft, yet loud enough for half the lobby to hear. "You've carried it for 7 years. In 7 years, you had 10,000 chances to destroy me. Yet you never pressed it once. Because you couldn't bear to. You couldn't bear to see me ruined. Just like back then you couldn't bear to send me away yourself." The room fell into dead silence. Everyone looked at Clara's hand. Her hand was trembling slightly. "Clara," Ethan continued, "the USB drive in your hand contains the edited version of the surveillance footage, showing only the scene where I forcibly kissed you. But the USB drive in my hand," he took out another USB drive from his pocket, "contains the full version, including the scene where I knelt on the ground begging you not to leave, and you crying and saying, 'I can't hurt you.'" Clara's pupils contracted sharply. "If you're going to release it, release the full version." Ethan held the USB drive in front of her. "Let everyone see that you have me in your heart too." In the lobby, everyone froze. Leo stood in the corner, the teacup slipping from his hand and smashing onto the floor with a crash. He knew. He had known all along. From the very beginning, Ethan knew Clara had the surveillance footage, and he knew she intended to release it. But he still came. He still proposed in public. He placed his life in her hands. Clara looked at the 2 USB drives before her, her chest heaving violently. Memories from 7 years ago flooded her mind. After the drinking party, he had forced a kiss on her. She pushed him away and threatened to call the police. He knelt on the ground, clutching her hand, begging her not to leave. "Clara," he said, "I like you. I've liked you since the first year of high school. It's been 3 years. I've been watching you all along. Can you not go?" she cried. She said, "Ethan, I can't hurt you." Then she went abroad overnight, staying away for 7 years. She thought she was protecting him. She thought she was letting him go. But she never expected. Clara. Ethan's voice brought her back to reality. Today is my mom's birthday. If you really want to go public, pick another day. I'll even go to the police station with you to turn yourself in. Catherine stood in the crowd, her eyes already red. She hadn't known there was such a past between her son and Clara. But she could tell that "I can't bear to let you go" was real. Ethan looked at Clara, his gaze calm, almost to the point of tragedy. But today, can you just let my mom finish her birthday? Clara stared at him. The USB drive in her hand dug into her palm, hurting even more. She began, her voice so hoarse she could barely speak. Then, she did something no one expected. She put the USB drive into her bag. It was the one he had handed her, the complete version. Then she extended her other hand, letting Ethan slip the ring onto her finger. "Ethan," she said, "this time, it's my turn to say I want to marry you." The lobby fell silent for 3 seconds. Then, a deafening roar of surprise erupted. Henry sighed deeply and turned his head, hiding the moisture in the corners of his eyes. Richard and Margaret looked at each other, and finally Margaret smiled first. But as she smiled, she began to cry. Catherine covered her mouth, and tears rolled down. William stood beside her, silent for a long time, then reached out and patted his wife's shoulder. Only Ethan looked at Clara and smiled. That smile was the brightest Leo had seen in the more than 10 years he had known him. However, Clara lowered her voice so only he could hear. "Remember one thing." "What?" "If you ever dare to pretend to be drunk or play the victim again," she said, articulating every word, "I will really kill you." Ethan froze for a moment. He thought back to that night 7 years ago. He had indeed drunk a lot, but not enough to be unconscious. He had done it on purpose. She saw through it. She had known all along. Ethan looked at her, didn't argue, and just smiled even more deeply. He stood up, hoisted the person over his shoulder in full view of everyone, and walked out the door. "All right," he said. "The wife calls the shots." "But..." He glanced back at Leo and said with a smile, "Tonight, let's settle the interest for the last 7 years. Leo stood amidst the shattered porcelain, watching the two disappear through the doorway, and couldn't help but curse. Fuck! Those two. A pair of born lunatics. He crouched down to clean up the pieces of the teacup when he suddenly heard someone beside him speak in a low voice. Was what he just said true? It was Vivian. She didn't know when she had moved to Leo's side, her eyes rimmed with red. "What?" Leo looked up. "He said he got down on his knees and begged her," Vivian said. "Someone like Ethan, begging on his knees?" Leo fell silent for a moment, then picked up the last piece of shattered porcelain. "It's true," he said. "I watched that surveillance footage. 7 years ago, he knelt in the hallway, holding a girl's hand, begging her not to leave. I've known him for 10 years, and I've never seen him so wretched. Later, he burned that footage onto over a dozen USB drives and carried them with him for years. He said that if she ever came back to destroy him, he would hand her the knife himself." Vivian fell silent. After a long time, she said, "Then why did she still leave?" Vivian fell silent. After a long time, she said, "Then why did she still leave?" Leo stood up and dusted off his hands. "Because she felt she couldn't harm him. 2 fools." Vivian watched the doorway. Ethan's car had already vanished into the night. 2 fools, she repeated, then laughed. After the birthday banquet, Clara sat in Ethan's car. The ring was still on her finger, its presence making everything feel slightly unreal. Ethan was driving, one hand on the steering wheel, while the other reached over to hold the hand wearing the ring. "Keep your eyes on the road," she said. He replied. But he didn't let go of her hand. The car stopped at the bottom of an apartment building. It was a new home he had prepared in advance. Clara looked at the building and remained silent for a while. "Ethan. You laid everything out on the table today." "Yeah. If I still choose to go public in the end, will you really turn yourself in?" Ethan turned off the engine and turned to look at her. I will. Why? Because I promised you, he said. 7 years ago, I said that if you didn't want me to ruin you, I would turn myself in. Clara froze. When did you ever say that? Ethan smiled. There wasn't any in the surveillance. That was what I said to the empty hallway after you left. Clara stared at him for a long time, then lowered her head. She took off the ring, held it in her hand, and turned it around a couple of times. Ethan. Yeah. I can wear this ring, she said. But we need time. How long? I'm not sure. She looked up at him. Maybe a month, maybe a year. Will you wait? Ethan smiled. Clara, I've waited 9 years for you. What's one more month? Clara was choked up by his words and pushed the car door open. Get out. Where to? Upstairs. She looked back at him. You're not going to make me go back to my parents' house tonight, are you? The way my dad looked at me just now, it was like he was already seeing a married daughter. Ethan got out of the car with her, unable to keep the corners of his mouth from turning up. In the elevator, he stood behind her, looking at her slender nape, and couldn't help but speak. Clara. Your USB drive. Let me keep it for you. Clara paused. Why? I don't want you to regret it one night in the middle of the night and go dig up that surveillance footage to watch again, he said. If you watch it, you'll be sad. If you're sad, you'll want to leave. And if you leave, I'll have to wait again. Then can't you stop making me sad? She turned to face him. Ethan, if you treat me badly in the future, I can expose it at any time. I know. He lowered his head to look at her. So keep it. You can keep it for a lifetime. But don't let it stand between us. The elevator arrived. The moment the doors opened, Ethan suddenly reached out and pulled her into his arms. Clara? His chin resting on the top of her head. It's been 7 years, and I haven't had a single peaceful night's sleep. Every night I think, if I hadn't been so impulsive back then, would you not have left? Later I figured it out. I don't regret it. Clara leaned against his chest and closed her eyes. I don't regret it either, she said. Regret what? Regret going abroad. She looked up at him. If I hadn't left, we might have fallen out long ago. Some feelings need time to settle. Just like wine, the older it gets, the better it tastes. Ethan looked at her and couldn't help but smile. So I'm a jar of wine you've cellared for 7 years? Yes. Clara pushed him away and walked through the door. The ceremony begins tonight. Ethan paused for a moment, then quickly followed. The door closed behind them. The motion sensor light in the hallway went out. Downstairs, Leo's car was still parked by the roadside. He sat in the car, looking at the illuminated window, picked up his phone to take a photo, and sent it to the family group chat. Leo, brothers witness history. Mr. Ethan is officially off the market tonight. The group chat fell silent for 3 seconds. One person replied, What's the situation? Did his proposal succeed? Leo, he carried him away right at the birthday banquet. Use your imagination. The other person replied, I bet he won't be able to get out of bed tomorrow. Leo, I bet he won't for a week. The group chat exploded. Leo tossed his phone onto the passenger seat, started the car, and took another look at that window. There were 2 silhouettes overlapping by the window, indistinct, but he knew. That was the scene Ethan had wanted most in his life. He shook his head and stepped on the gas. Madman, he said, but there was a smile in his voice. Early the next morning, Leo was woken up by the phone. Hello? He answered groggily. It's me. Ethan's voice sounded unexpectedly sober. Go check something for me. Leo glanced at his phone screen. It was 6:30 in the morning. Ethan, didn't you last night? Go check it first, then sleep. Leo hurled the pillow at the ceiling. Speak. Clara brought a piano back with her on this trip to China. Check the model of that piano for me, Ethan said, and contact the best piano tuner in the North City to come to my house before this afternoon. Leo paused for 3 seconds. You came all this way early in the morning just for this? Also, Ethan paused. Help me set up a meeting with Vivian. Why ask her out? Catching up. Leo hung up the phone, stared blankly at the ceiling for a long while, then resignedly got up to wash up. That afternoon, Vivian appeared in Ethan's office. Leo let her in, then tactfully closed the door and stepped out. There were only two people in the office. Ethan sat behind the desk, and Vivian sat opposite him. After half a minute of silence, it was Vivian who spoke first. "Uncle, did you ask me here just to say thank you?" Ethan looked at her. "You knelt for 3 hours that day." "Yeah." "Are you hurt?" "My knee is bruised." Vivian smiled. "But it's fine. My boyfriend massaged it for me for 3 days." Ethan nodded. "I owe you a favor regarding the engagement. You helped me resolve the Lin family's forced marriage, so we're even." Vivian said, "But if you really want to make it up to me, can I make a request?" "Speak. If you and my little aunt get into an argument in the future, don't come to me to pass messages." Ethan smiled. "Okay." Vivian stood up, preparing to leave. "Vivian," Ethan suddenly called out to her. Is your boyfriend the one who brought you an umbrella in the rain that day?" Vivian paused, turned her head to look at him, and asked, "How do you know?" "That day I waited in the car for you for 5 minutes and saw a guy run over, hand you an umbrella, and then run off in the rain. The direction he was running in was the school." "Is your boyfriend a high school student?" Vivian's face instantly flushed red. "Yes. He's a senior, a year younger than me." Ethan looked at her thoroughly flushed face and smiled. "Do you know how old I was when I was chasing your little aunt?" 14. "Freshman year," Ethan said. 16 years old. Liking someone has nothing to do with age. Vivian stared at him, her eyes suddenly feeling a bit hot. "Uncle, did you pursue my aunt like that back then?" "I was even more cowardly than him." Ethan leaned back against the chair. "I only dared to watch from afar. When I brought her water, I didn't dare sign my name, and when I lent her an umbrella, I claimed I liked getting caught in the rain. And then after the college entrance exam, I couldn't hold back." Vivian widened her eyes. "Then she ran away." Ethan smiled. "She was gone for 7 years. So tell your boyfriend, don't ever be like me." Vivian paused for a moment, then nodded firmly. "I understand." She walked to the door, then turned back. "Uncle." "Yeah. I wish you both happiness." Ethan smiled. "We will." After Vivian left, Leo pushed the door open and came in. "I've found out about the piano." "Speak." "That piano was made in Germany. It was the only piece of luggage Clara took with her when she went abroad 7 years ago. It's been 7 years, and she's been practicing on that piano the whole time. Also," Leo hesitated. "I found out that in the recordings of every performance, the last piece she plays is always the same one. Für Elise." Ethan froze. For Elise. The first piece he heard her play at the school welcome party in his freshman year. That day, she sat on stage in a white dress with black hair, and the sound of the piano fell into his heart, never to leave again. "Leo, get something ready for me." "What?" Ethan looked out the window, his gaze calm. "A plot of land, next to the church. I've had my eye on it for 9 years. I'm going to handle the paperwork tomorrow." Leo paused for a moment. "What are you going to build?" "Build a house to put that piano in." Leo opened his mouth, but ultimately said nothing. He left the office and gently closed the door behind him. In the hallway, he sent a message to the family group chat. "Ethan asked me to look into a piano today." Group chat. "And then, Leo, and then I found out he might spend 7 figures to buy a plot of land, just to build a house for that piano." The group chat fell silent for a long time. Then someone replied, "You must be crazy." Leo looked at those 3 words, shook his head, and typed, "I'm not crazy. I waited 9 years, and I finally made it." Another 3 days passed. Every morning, Clara went to practice the piano. In the afternoon, she went to the company to handle the handover for the merger case, and in the evening she returned to Ethan's apartment. Their lives were suddenly squeezed into a cramped space, bumping into each other, but ultimately moving in the same direction. That evening, when Clara came home from work, she discovered something new in the apartment's living room. A piano, exactly the same as the one she had used abroad for 7 years. She froze in the doorway, staring at the piano, her fingers trembling slightly. Ethan poked his head out of the kitchen. "You're back? Wash your hands and let's eat." "Ethan," she called him. This piano. I had someone tune it." Ethan walked out, wiping his hands. "Same model as yours, original German make." "When did you?" "I wanted to buy it the year you went abroad." He walked over to the piano and touched the lid. "But I was afraid no one would play it. Now someone will." Clara stood where she was, watching him. This man had been doing one thing day after day for 9 years. Waiting for her. "Ethan." She walked up to him and looked up at him. Back then? Exactly when did you start liking me?" Ethan thought for a moment. "At first sight. On the first day of high school, you walked in through the back door of the classroom. You were wearing a white uniform, your hair in a ponytail, and your eyes were so bright. I thought, I'm a goner." Clara couldn't help but laugh. "What's over?" "I'm done for. My life is over." Ethan lowered his head to look at her. "Every day from now on, I'll want to look at you one more time." Clara didn't speak. She reached out and hugged him. "Ethan." Her voice was muffled against his chest. "Yeah. Let's go get our marriage certificate tomorrow." Ethan froze for a moment. Then he tightened his arms, pulling her tight into his embrace. "Okay." The next day at the Civil Affairs Bureau, Leo drove them there, stealing glances in the rearview mirror the whole way. Ethan held Clara's hand the entire time, their fingers interlaced, never letting go for a moment. When the photo was being taken, the photographer said, "Bride and groom, look at the camera and smile." Ethan turned his head and glanced at Clara. Clara also happened to turn her head to look at him at that very moment. Their profiles faced the camera, both with smiles on their lips. Leo sat in the waiting area, watching that photo being printed, and couldn't help but take out his phone to snap a picture. He sent it to Vivian. "Your little aunt and little uncle got their marriage license today." Vivian instantly replied with a crying face emoji. "I've been waiting for this day for so long." Leo, "Why are you crying?" Vivian, "I'm happy for them." Leo smiled and put away his phone. Over there, Ethan and Clara had finished the formalities and were walking out holding their red marriage certificates. Clara looked down at the photo on the marriage certificate, and Ethan stood beside her, looking down as well. "Ugly," Clara said. "You're not ugly," Ethan said. "Look, my hair is a mess. It looks good even when it's messy." Leo, unable to stand listening any longer, chimed in from the side. "Do you two want me to step out for a moment?" Ethan didn't even look up. "You should have stayed away." Leo. Clara closed the marriage certificate and glanced at Ethan. "You're back. Let's go home." "What are we eating today?" "What do you want to eat?" "Whatever you make is fine." "That won't do. You have to pick what you like." Leo silently took 3 steps back, feeling that he had gone from a driver to a third wheel, and then from a third wheel to thin air. He took out his phone and snapped another photo of the two of them from behind. The sunlight slanted in through the entrance of the Civil Affairs Bureau, casting 2 long shadows that overlapped with each other. He made a post with a caption of only 4 words, "Finally." 3 months into their marriage, Clara discovered she was pregnant. That morning, she stared at the pregnancy test in the bathroom for 3 minutes, then walked into the bedroom holding it and shook Ethan awake. "Ethan. Just 5 more minutes." "Ethan. I'm pregnant." Ethan opened his eyes abruptly, sitting up so fast it was as if he'd been shocked. He glanced at the pregnancy test, then at her, before pulling her into his arms. "Really? Really? Are you sure?" 2 lines. "I checked 3 times." Ethan held her, remaining silent for a long time. Clara felt his breathing grow heavy, and a damp warmth seeped through the fabric on her shoulder. She reached out and patted his back. "Don't cry." "I'm not crying," he said, his voice muffled. "Then let go of me. Let me take a look." "I won't let go." "Ethan, let me hold you for a while."
Klar side and let him hold her.
Sunlight streamed in through the window, falling onto the covers over the two of them. She lowered her head, looking at her flat stomach, and suddenly felt a sense of unreality. 9 years ago, she sat in a high school classroom. The boy next to her was quiet and reserved. She thought he hated her. 9 years later, she lay in this man's arms, carrying their child. Fate is something no one can ever explain. On the day of the prenatal checkup, Ethan took the entire day off. Leo was handling documents for him in the office and sent a message to the family group chat by the way. "Mr. Ethan took the day off today. He said he's accompanying his wife for a prenatal checkup." The group chat instantly went wild. "Holy crap! She's pregnant. That fast. You really have to hand it to Mr. Ethan for his efficiency." Leo looked at the screen, smiled, and then dialed Vivian's number. "Hello. Your youngest aunt is pregnant." There was silence on the other end of the line for 3 seconds, followed by Vivian's scream, "Really? Really, the prenatal checkup is today. I'm going to see her. I'm taking leave right now." "No, no, no. Your uncle-in-law said he's only keeping his wife company today and won't see anyone." "Vivian. He really is my uncle-in-law." Leo hung up the phone with a smile. On the way back from the prenatal checkup, Ethan was driving, and Clara sat in the passenger seat holding the ultrasound report. The image on the paper was blurry, but a tiny embryo could faintly be seen. "Ethan." "Yeah. Boy or girl, what do you think?" Ethan glanced at the ultrasound report. "Either is fine." "Either one? Don't you want to know?" "A boy would look like you, and a girl would look like you too," he said. "Either one is fine." Clara couldn't help but laugh. "How is it that you always manage to turn everything back to me?" "Because I only revolve around you in this life," he said naturally, as if stating a fact. Clara remained silent and turned to look out the window. Outside the car window, the roadside trees swept by, with tender green buds sprouting from the branches in early spring. She thought back to the night she went abroad 7 years ago. As the plane took off, she watched the lights of North City outside the porthole, thinking she would never return. But she did come back, and she would never leave again. Clara's pregnancy went smoothly, except for her picky appetite. One night at 3 a.m., she suddenly woke Ethan up. "I want wontons from that place in the south of the city." Ethan glanced at his phone in a daze. It was 3:07. "Now?" "Yeah. That shop doesn't open until 6 a.m. Clara looked at him, saying nothing. Ethan remained silent for 3 seconds, then lifted the quilt and got out of bed. "I'll wait by the door." "Are you crazy? It's 3 in the morning. Then what should we do? Don't you want to eat?" Clara looked at his back as he hurriedly put on his coat and suddenly smiled. "Forget it, I won't eat." "No way, if you want to eat, you have to eat." Ethan tied his shoelaces. "You lie down. I'll bring you soy milk when I get back." "Ethan." The door was already closed. Clara lay in bed, looking at the ceiling, and smiled for a long time. That morning at 6:10, Ethan returned with steaming hot wontons and soy milk. As soon as he walked in, he saw Clara sitting on the sofa with red-rimmed eyes. "What's wrong?" "Nothing much." She took the wontons, lowered her head, and took a bite. "I just feel like I married a fool." Ethan sat down beside her and reached out to stroke her hair. "A fool still married you." "Shut up." "Okay." 9 months later, Clara gave birth to a boy in the delivery room. Ethan waited outside for 4 hours, pacing restlessly. Leo's repeated attempts to tell him, "Relax, relax, relax," were of no use. When the nurse pushed open the door and called out, "Clara's family," Ethan practically rushed over. "It's a boy, 6 pounds and 8 ounces. Mother and baby are safe." Ethan stood at the doorway, frozen in place. Leo gave him a shove. "What are you waiting for? Go on in." Only then did he walk in. In the delivery room, Clara lay in bed, her face pale but her eyes bright. A wrinkled baby lay swaddled in the small bed nearby, eyes closed, mouth slightly open. Ethan walked over and looked at Clara first. "You've worked hard." His voice was a bit hoarse. "It's fine." Clara smiled. "Take a look at him." Only then did Ethan turn his head to look at the baby. It was tiny, very wrinkled, very ugly. But as he looked at it, he suddenly raised his hand to cover his eyes. "Ethan." Clara called his name softly. "Yeah." "Crying again?" "No." He lowered his hand, and his eyes were indeed red. "Just got some sand in my eyes." "Where did the sand in the delivery room come from?" "I don't know." Clara didn't call him out. She simply reached out and held his hand. Both their palms were sweaty, but they held on tight. On the day of the full moon celebration, the Lynn family villa was bustling once again. Vivian held the child, unable to put him down. "Uncle, your son looks just like you." Ethan glanced at the child. "Is looking like me a bad thing?" "It's good that it is," Vivian said. "I'm just afraid he'll be like you too, chasing a girl for 9 years. Ethan smiled. "What's wrong with chasing for 9 years? As long as you win her over, it's worth it." Vivian rolled her eyes, but the corners of her mouth were curled in a smile. Standing beside her was a tall, thin guy in a white shirt, looking a bit reserved. Vivian patted him on the shoulder. "Let me introduce you. This is my boyfriend, Evan." Evan nodded at Ethan. "Hello." Ethan looked at him and suddenly asked, "Would you give her an umbrella? Then say you like getting caught in the rain?" Evan paused for a moment. "Huh." Vivian's face instantly flushed red. "Uncle." Ethan smiled and patted Evan on the shoulder. "Treat her well. Otherwise, I'll teach her how to use the surveillance cameras." Evan was completely bewildered, but Vivian had already dragged him away. Leo walked over from the side holding a wine glass. "Why are you scaring the kid?" "Just vetting him for Vivian." Ethan took the wine glass. "That kid has innocent eyes. He's not bad." Leo clicked his tongue. "You had innocent eyes back then too, but you still dared to." "That's different." "What's the difference?" "I was prepared back then." Ethan looked at Clara holding a child not far away. "I knew she had me in her heart." "How do you know?" "Every time she finished playing for Elise, she would glance in my direction, even if it was only for a fraction of a second. But I knew she was looking at me." Leo fell silent for a moment, then raised his glass. "I give up. 9 years and you've practically developed eagle eyes." Ethan ignored his teasing, set down his glass, and walked toward Clara. She had taken the child from Vivian and was looking down, coaxing him gently. "Give me a hug," Ethan said. "Will you?" Clara looked up at him. "No," he answered honestly. "But you can teach me." Clara smiled and carefully placed their son into his arms. Ethan was stiff as a board. "Just relax," she said. "I can't relax. He's just a kid, not a bomb. Scarier than a bomb." Clara couldn't help but laugh, reaching out to support his arm. "Yes, like that. Hold the back of your head." "Yeah. Raise your arm a little." "Okay. Look into my eyes." Ethan raised his head and met her gaze. Separated by the distance of an infant, their eyes locked. 9 years ago, he stole glances at her in the classroom. 9 years later, she stood before him, teaching him how to hold their child. "Ethan," she suddenly said. I'll chase you in the next life." Ethan paused for a moment. "What?" "You chased me for 9 years in this life." Clara looked at him. "In the next life, it'll be my turn to chase you. I'll chase you for 9 years too, and I won't give up until I catch you." Ethan lowered his head to look at the child in his arms, then looked up at her and suddenly smiled. "Okay. In the next life, I'll wait for you to chase me." 1 year later, the first snow of the year began to fall again in the North City. Ethan stood at the church entrance watching Clara inside. She was wearing a long white dress, sitting in front of a brand new piano. her fingers dancing across the black and white keys. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, falling on her shoulders, on the piano keys, and on the corners of her slightly upturned mouth.
Cher was playing für Elise.
Ethan leaned against the doorframe, not entering. He waited for the final note of the piece to fall before stepping inside. Clara. She turned back, saw him, and smiled. You're here. He walked over to her side. Today is our second wedding anniversary. I know. You promised me you would play the piano for me in the church. Aren't I playing it for you right now? Ethan looked at her and suddenly dropped to one knee. Clara froze. What are you doing? He pulled a red velvet box from his pocket and opened it. Inside lay another ring, simpler than the one from our wedding, yet it caught the sunlight in tiny, shimmering fragments. 2 years ago, I proposed at the birthday banquet, using the grandeur of the Lin family. Today, I want to propose again, in my own way. Clara looked down at him, her eyes slowly reddening. Ethan. Yeah. Aren't you annoying? Annoying, he admitted frankly. But even if it's annoying, I still have to ask. Because this is the only time I'll ask in this life. Clara didn't speak and held out her hand. Ethan slipped the ring onto her ring finger, right next to the old one. The two rings rested side by side, like two circles finally intersecting. He stood up and pulled her into his arms. Clara. Yeah. Thank you. What are you thanking me for? Thank you for coming back. Thank you for keeping that surveillance footage unreleased for 7 years. Thank you for marrying me. Thank you for giving me children. Clara leaned against his chest, her voice muffled. Are you done? Not yet. He lowered his head, leaning close to her ear. And thank you for planning to chase me in the next life. Clara smiled. She raised her head and looked into his eyes. Ethan. Yeah. In this lifetime, I love only you. Ethan paused for a moment. Then he smiled. That smile was exactly the same as the one that had quietly risen in his heart 9 years ago when he first saw her in the classroom. Clara. Yeah. In the next life, I will wait for you only. Outside the church, the snow fell harder and harder. Leo crouched on the steps smoking, while Vivian and her boyfriend stood beside him. Why aren't they out yet? Vivian stomped her frozen feet. Leo blew a smoke ring. Your uncle is proposing. Proposing again? Vivian widened her eyes. Didn't he already propose? He said that last time was just for show for the Lin family, so it doesn't count. Vivian fell silent for 3 seconds, then turned to her boyfriend and said, Evan, if you ever dare to propose twice, I'll throw you into the moat. Evan, I don't even dare to propose once. Vivian rolled her eyes, then smiled. The church doors finally opened. Ethan and Clara walked out hand in hand, the sound of a piano trailing behind them as the autoplay system switched to the next track. As the intro to that song started, the cigarette fell from Leo's hand. Fuck, he said. Vivian asked, What's wrong? Leo looked at the two people walking out of the door, his voice a little hoarse. This song. It's the one Ethan had on repeat for a month back then, before he got drunk at that party. He said back then that if he ever married Clara, he had to play this at the wedding. I thought he'd forgotten it long ago. Vivian didn't speak. She watched Ethan and Clara, walking side by side through the snow, their fingers interlaced. Clara held their son in her arms, his little head resting on his mother's shoulder, sleeping soundly. Vivian raised her phone and took a picture. She posted a message with just one line of text. 9 years of waiting, finally fulfilled. Their story has only just begun. In the snow, 2 lines of footprints stretched forward. One belonged to Ethan, the other to Clara. In the middle was a tiny, shallow trail, the trace of their son being carried. 3 lines intertwined, stretching from the church door all the way to their home in the distance.